Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar presented by Validation Institute, using technology and data to reduce COVID-19 transmission and other enduring risks and anxiety in the conference, hospitality, travel, entertainment, and related industries. Now, before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to go over a few housekeeping items. If you're having any problems viewing the webinar or encounter any technical difficulties, please use your chat box to send a question directly to me, the host, and we'll try to help you. Second, I'd like to explain how we're handling questions. Due to the number of attendees, participant lines are muted. If you'd like to submit a question for our presenters, please do so using the question box on the right side of your screen. Please submit your questions to all panelists. We'll be monitoring the questions for anything urgent, but we really want to respect everyone's time and try to keep this webinar within the allotted time frame. We'll answer all those we have time to address during the program. Otherwise, we'll contact you offline. Please do feel free to contact our presenters with any additional questions, and please note that this webinar will be recorded. You'll receive an email with a link to the video so that we can view it, so you can view it again. And I'll now turn it over to Vidar Jurgensen to get us started on today's webinar.
Welcome. I'm Vidar Jurgensen, chairman of the Validation Institute, and our mission is to bring price and outcomes transparency to healthcare and other industries that affect health of our population. The COVID-19 crisis that we're in right now is so fast moving that we're going to focus first on where we are today, where we would like to get to in 12 months, and then where we would like to try to get to in the next 2 years or so. We believe that by using data, technology, and science, we can reduce the anxiety and reduce the transmission of the disease. And the mission of this conference call, is to help move us in that direction. I'm now going to introduce Al Lewis, who is co-founder of the Validation Institute and also founder of Quizify, which takes learnings from conferences like this and puts them in a questionnaire format that employers can provide to their employees. Al, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lipkin. Dr. Ian Lipkin has graciously agreed to spend most of the next hour answering our questions, of which there are many, about novel coronavirus. Many have been submitted in advance, and you may be able to use the chat box to ask others. By way of background, Ian is the John Snow Professor of Epidemiology, Professor of Neurology and Pathology and Cell Biology at Columbia University, where he is also Director of the Center for Infection and Immunity. Now, I've been following his career for many years, so I can tell you a few things he may be too modest to mention. He's made multiple trips to China both before and after the outbreak, and had long ago advised them to shut down their wild animal markets to avoid exactly this risk. Those of you who saw the movie Contagion, which contains some eerie similarities to the current outbreak, will not be surprised to learn that he was the consulting epidemiologist for that movie. Most impressively, within the last few days, he's been featured on both Lou Dobbs and Rachel Maddow. Now, that's rare enough on its own, but rarer still is the fact that neither of them hollered at him. Now, I'm listed as co-presenter here, but I will be turning my time slot over to Ian because he's the guy you came to hear. And while I'm often not the smartest guy in the room, it's rather depressing not to be the smartest guy in the room when there are only 2 people in the room. And yet, when I'm with Ian, that's what happened. As Quizmeister and Chief of Quizify, though, as Vidar mentioned, I will be adapting this material to fit our series of employee-focused Corona literacy quizzes and making them available to attendees within a couple of days. Once Ian is wrapped, Tommy Anolis will wrap up with some specific advice for food safety and operational execution in the restaurant industry. And now I will turn this over to Vidar to moderate.
Well, we'll turn it right over to Ian for his presentation, and then we have a growing list of questions. Ian, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the invitation. By way of full disclosure, Al is my brother-in-law, and when his sister, and my wife are in the room, neither of us is the smartest one in the room. So with that preamble, let me go into it. This virus, which originally came from a bat and moved into humans, has probably been circulating in the human population since the latter part of 2019. It first came to my attention on December 15th when I received a call from a colleague at Sun Yat-sen University who suggested that there was a new pneumonia that was circulating in Wuhan. I reached out to him to try to help with characterization of the virus, and he said that he was doing fine, and then on the 31st, called and told me that he'd identified the virus, but that it was not particularly transmissible, so there was really nothing to worry about. And then, as you all know, it's evolved in what it is today, and it is by far the most remarkable health threat that I've encountered, certainly in my career, and probably since the 1918 flu pandemic. You will read a lot from various people who are making, various estimates as to what the final death count will be. Some people are projecting millions will die. Other people are projecting that it will be in the neighborhood of tens of thousands, and the answer is we really don't know. And it's a function really of whether or not we do or don't respond in a coherent fashion. Much of my work for the past several days has been in trying to persuade various people who are at the national, state, and local levels to isolate people more vigorously and to move us toward the sort of lockdown that we now have in the Bay Area on the West Coast and that was so effective in China. I was in China in January, came back the 4th of February, and I can tell you that the most important intervention there was isolation. There was no drug, there was no vaccine. There was an effort to try to force everybody to stay in-house. The other thing that was extremely important was that they established hospital facilities and they moved in everyone who was infected. This allowed them to have those people who were not yet infected, who were family members of those who were infected, to stay in-house. Some of them didn't convert. The ones who were placed into these hospitals did, and this took the transmission rate down from 1 to 3 down to 1 to 0.3. So it reduced it dramatically by a factor of an order of magnitude. And this is what brought this pandemic under control. The virus is a coronavirus. It simply refers to the morphology and electron microscopy. These are highly transmissible viruses. For many, many years, the coronaviruses were studied as models for human central nervous system diseases. People then began to appreciate their role in respiratory disease. Then we had our first major outbreak, which was in 2003, which was the SARS, first one of these beta coronaviruses. Then we had MERS. MERS came from Saudi Arabia. It had a much higher mortality rate than either SARS or this new SARS-CoV-2. And then we have SARS-CoV-2. Nobody really knows the mortality rate yet of SARS-CoV-2 because we don't know the denominator. All we know are the number of people who do die, and we have some sense of the number of people who present and are diagnosed with disease. But even that is likely to be incomplete. If forced to guess, I would think that the mortality rate is somewhere between what we see with flu and what we see with SARS, which means that the majority of the deaths that we see are not because this virus is capable of causing some more disease in an individual, but rather that so many people are infected. The chances are very good that as much as a third of the world's population will become infected. The other thing I want to say is that this virus is going to be with us for a long time to come. And until we have a vaccine, we will continue to see pockets of this virus appearing from reservoirs around the world. At present, it's on every continent with the exception of Antarctica. And I think that's fine for an intro, and then we can move into questions.
Well, I'll start with some of the first questions that came in. Was there anything from your recent trip to China that surprised you that hasn't been reported widely?
Well, I referenced one of the things that was surprising. That was how long we knew about this and how wrong we were in assessing its pathogenic potential. It was not thought to be a major cause of human disease, and it was not thought to be particularly transmissible. We now know that that's not the case. The other thing I would say that's unusual, though not for me, but other people may not be aware of this, is that the infrastructure now for control of infectious diseases is really second to none. They have excellent facilities, a very strong CDC, and they have been transparent. And when people say to me, you know, they're not, I say, well, if they weren't being transparent, they wouldn't tell you their death rates. So it is, it's very different than it was in 2003, where we didn't learn about this virus for several months until after it first begun to cause damage.
I heard on National Public Radio this morning that yesterday China reported just one additional confirmed case. Does that sound credible to you? And do you think there's the potential of a recurrence through community spread in China?
So I'm sure if they told you there was one confirmed case, that is the only confirmed case they have. That doesn't mean that they only have one case. So unless you test, unless you see the patient, you don't know there's another case. But it seemed unlikely to me that they would have only one case. Their borders, like ours, are porous.
Now, the same article, again, the same broadcast for National Public Radio reported that Volkswagen was able to restart all but 2 of its factories in China. Do you feel that China is getting back to normal in terms of, at least in terms of manufacturing?
I think they are returning toward normal. I know that several commercial facilities are opening and shops are opening, but they took a very, very hard tack. They pushed hard to shut down everything. They shut down Guangzhou, Beijing, as well as Wuhan and Shanghai. And one of the things that I've been trying to emphasize here in the United States is that we will ultimately have to do something similar. The faster we move to that particular position, the sooner we'll be out and the more effective we'll be. It's much easier to leverage the power of the national government if you do it when the problem is small. Had we done so, for example, in the state of Washington at an earlier time point, I think we might have been better off. And I think that Trump's decision, for example, to close borders to some extent was very, very useful. I'm not referring to what's proposed at the southern border. I'm talking about infectious disease control, where you limit people coming in from other areas. I think that it should have extended to all of Europe, not just to the continent. And I'm pushing very, very hard right now to get some sort of a national policy by which we would get everybody to shelter in place.
So is that the biggest step, getting everyone to shelter in place? And are there additional steps that you think we should take right away at the federal level?
At present, all we have is shelter in place. We don't have an approved drug. We can talk about various interventional strategies. We won't have a vaccine for another probably 16 to 18 months. So the only thing we really have at present is isolation. And for that to be effective, it has to be aggressive.
And what do you think the odds are of actually having a successful vaccine within 18 months? Do you see any particular barriers, or do you think it's just that is what's required to?
I don't see any obstacles to making a vaccine. This is not like influenza or HIV, where we have a rapidly evolving target that we need to continually revise, the weapon to address. What we have here is a fairly simple virus. We know what it looks like. We understand its structure. We can make antibodies to it and neutralize it. So it's a question really of going through safety testing and efficacy testing. And this is a process that, really cannot be shortcut, because sometimes we have adverse events when we build no vaccine. So we have a regular algorithm that we employ for taking things through to approval.
And are there things that you think this shelter in place has to be done at the federal level? And until that happens, are there any states that you think have set a better example than others in terms of taking the lead?
California is the first one to behave in a way that I really think is rational. I live in the state of New York. It's been very difficult to persuade the mayor and the governor to close the schools. We finally have done this. The challenge, of course, is that if you have young people who now have no place to go, then they wind up, they may get into difficulties, they may get into trouble. Some of these people require the school system to provide breakfast and lunch, so they lose their nutrition. And it's a politically very difficult position for a politician to adopt. That said, these are unusual times, and this is what we need to do. If it's mandated at the federal level, we'll have a much better, likelihood of actually getting this thing under control. If New Jersey and Connecticut have different approaches than New York, it's going to be tough. So what we really need to do is to, as was done in China, tell people that they have to remain indoors. For those people who are engaged in essential services like providing utilities, food, maintaining telecommunications, those individuals need to do whatever it is they need to do outside of the confines of their homes. But everyone else needs to stay indoors. And in the event that run out of food or some other provision, you select one person to go out and represent the group. That's still short of what the Chinese did. The Chinese actually went in, identified people who were sick, and removed them to these hospitals. These hospitals were not quite so much focused on providing care as they were as providing containment.
And are there other countries that you would rank as next to China in their response, including, say, countries like Singapore, South Korea?
Well, Singapore is an unusual example. I mean, Singapore is a country, yes, but basically it's one large city. So it's much easier to do something in Singapore than it is to do it in a country the size of China or the United States. They engaged in very active surveillance using testing. This is not something that we can do as easily as they could. So I think this is what we've got. And I think testing is something that, we will continue to emphasize. But the intervention that's going to make a difference is going to be the isolation.
And what should business leaders do now, and then what should they do to create a situation where we get back to something resembling normal sooner rather than later?
This is not anything that I really understand. I feel for you all and the people, obviously, who work for you, these businesses, but I don't know what to do with respect to businesses.
Okay. And if the federal government were to follow your recommendations of a very strict shelter-in-place policy and enforce that, what difference would that make in terms of the range of time it would take to get back to something that resembled normal economic production?
So the way I would look at that would be to say the following. We have a mean incubation period of 5 to 7 days. And if we take it out, say, 3 generations, I would say, but this requires very focused, rigorous investment in this policy. If you take it out 3 generations, or perhaps 4 if they're outside, that would be 28 days. So you would cut the chain of transmission, you reduce the R naught for the first group, and you reduce it again and again and again. With each subsequent iteration of 5 to 7 days, you would have a dramatic reduction. And I think we would get down to that R naught of 0.3, which is when things burn out. The R naught is the number of people who become infected by a given individual. You want to get it well under 1 because that means that there is nothing to sustain it. But when it's 3, then every single cycle you get 3 people, then 9. It goes on bigger and bigger and bigger. So I think if we invest in, as a country, in the social distancing in a very extreme way, we can get this under control in a month. But that means we have to commit to that. If we do something which is half-hearted, we're not going to achieve that. Maybe we'll get down to an R naught of 1.5, but you need to get well under 1 to burn out this particular pandemic.
Are there other countries that are getting to well under 1?
No. Nobody's done this really except China, using this kind of social distancing approach. And there's a lot of, you can see what's happened in Italy, and it's happening in Spain and so forth. People are resistant to the social distancing because what happens is you don't really see just how bad it is, because you're percolating along with a few cases, say, oh, we've only got 100 cases, but suddenly the next day it's 200 cases. And because you've got these groups that are incubating, the day after that it's 400, the day after that it's 800, and so forth. So by the time you get to the end of that period of 4 or 5 days, suddenly you have 1,000 cases. And then you begin to overwhelm emergency rooms, and people who need to be seen for trauma or for strokes or for heart attacks can't get seen. So this is a huge problem, and it's something that we need to address rigorously and directly. And I think the president made headway yesterday for the first time in acknowledging the extent of the problem, but he didn't go far enough.
And what are the states or areas in the country that are getting closest to overwhelming their local hospital facilities?
Any of the urban centers. I think what we're going to find is that in California, as a result of what's now been done, that although there may be a continued climb in cases, in about a week, 10 days, you'll begin to see it taper off. And then what some people say to me is, we need California to do the experiment to demonstrate to the rest of the country that this is an approach that's viable and productive. And I say, we've already done this experiment in China. We know what it looks like. We should adopt this nationally.
Is there any evidence anywhere that you've seen that the virus is mutating significantly?
There are people talking about the virus mutating, but that's not going to move the needle. The issue really is this virus is very well adapted to humans, grows quite well, it reproduces itself, and it will continue to do this, and it will continue to cause damage until such time as we bite the bullet and do what needs to be done. If we had a vaccine, it would be different. We could vaccinate everybody, but we don't, and we won't for several months. So we are right now at a tipping point where either we're going to address this coherently or we're going to slide off the edge.
Are there any additional things to sheltering in place that the federal government should do, like speeding up the availability of testing? I read that the tests would be available in 2,000 facilities. Well, why not all 6,000 hospitals and all of LabCorp and Quest? Is there any?
Testing is important. It's not as important as it was a while ago when we really needed it. When you had very sparse, examples of clusters, you could test people who came into contact with those individuals, and you could say these people need to be isolated. But now this thing is everywhere. So even with testing, although I'm not discouraging testing, I actually spend much of my career now still building tests. I think it's beyond the point where testing is gonna be the big cure for this. What we need to do is isolation. We need sheltering in place. And it's nothing that anybody wants to hear. But that's the bitter medicine we have to swallow. If we had tested earlier, I think we wouldn't be in this position.
And what can we do over the next 12 months beyond sheltering in place to make sure that it is less likely to come back, or at least we're in a better position to deal with the virus if it returns on a seasonal basis? What needs to be in place
So
to
if the
manage that?
Right. So if the virus comes back under control and the number of cases begins to drop, then testing will again become absolutely paramount. Because every time there's a new cluster of respiratory illness, we'll be able to say this is or is not the novel coronavirus, and we will be able to isolate accordingly. There's a lot of background of other respiratory noise that people don't know about. Rhinoviruses, influenza viruses, other things. Some of these can be treated with specific drugs. We don't have anything yet for this one, but we are trying now to explore the possibility that certain drugs can be repurposed from other uses, such as treatment of HIV, AIDS, or cancer, or other viral infections. And we're also looking at the possibility of immunotherapy, getting antibodies from people who have recovered, and they should have activity against this virus. And there's some preliminary data from China that suggests that that is true.
So there's a lot of fear and anxiety in the public, and we have a lot of people on the webinar today that are in the hospitality, the travel, the food service, the hotel, and the conference business. And they want to be able to lay the groundwork to reduce that anxiety for the long run. What do you think they could be doing now to lay the groundwork? There's not much they can do other than to maybe encourage the shelter-in-place policies, but there is probably something that they should be laying the groundwork for the long run, like in areas of being able to better track disease, maybe for meetings, maybe for hotels. Do you think that once this is more under control, say in a year